Hi, it's May the 4th, and we're here at Swansea University with two academics who have done actual research on Star Wars, Dr. Mc Veigh and Dr. David Anderson. So during the next 30 to 45 minutes, we'll talk about different aspects of Star Wars, from its origins to its cultural impact. And we'll also talk about little-known Star Wars trivia. For example, the coup George Lucas pulled in signing a special contract with 20th Century Fox to produce Star Wars. So Steve, Dave, thanks for being here. So I think it's fair to call you both Star Wars academics because you've actually published research on Star Wars.
Yes.
So to start with, can you just talk us through your research and how you became fans of Star Wars? Maybe we can start with you, Steve.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's the other way around, I suppose. I became a fan of Star Wars from 5 years old. I was there in 1978. It would have been opened in the UK in 1977, December 77. And I would have seen it in that year. So in terms of being a fan, I've been a fan for a long, long time. In terms of being an academic using Star Wars, my research is interested in things like mythology, American political culture, American cultural history. So Star Wars is a fascinating window onto all of those things, the way in which patterns of mythology have changed over time. So, you know, in 1977, Star Wars appears, and it's this optimistic film which is full of all sorts of mythological elements. But it's a time in America where myth seems to be in bad shape. It's post-Vietnam, Nixon and Watergate, and all sorts of things have gone horribly wrong since that promise of the 1960s. So my take on Star Wars and the stuff that I've published is in those ways of using Star Wars as a vehicle for kind of gaining access, I suppose, to times gone by, to a version of America which has passed. And I think although we're talking about the original Star Wars in some ways there, I think the trilogies that have followed on from there have all had that engagement with American issues, American mythologies, American historical moments.
And Dave, do you remember when you became a fan of Star Wars from
Absolutely.
the beginning?
Yeah, in ways similar to Steve, I guess. I've been a fan since childhood. Particularly interested, I guess, in nostalgia in childhood and how the original toy line seems to invoke a nostalgia amongst everyone, really. Everyone seems to have a story to tell about Star Wars figures and play sets and so on, regardless of which movie they remember as a kid. It's amazing when you talk to people the number of memories that come forward from various people talking about their memories of Christmas or birthdays or perhaps a figure that they got from a gran or an aunt or so on. So I'm really interested in that connection, how it can invoke nostalgia for childhood and other memories as well, and the stories and experiences that come from that.
And we obviously have this great collection of toys here. We'll come back to this later. I just wanted to start by getting a bit of an overview of the origins of Star Wars, because we know that George Lucas initially found it quite difficult to pitch Star Wars to production companies. So why did companies miss such a big hit?
Well, no, and that's it. It seems unthinkable now that in the first instance, nobody wanted Star Wars. George Lucas was a young filmmaker. He'd made 2 films by the time he started hawking his treatment of Star Wars around, THX 1138 and then American Graffiti. But it was seen it was a genre that studios didn't like. They thought science fiction didn't appeal to a mass audience, that it was only for guys and young guys at that. They didn't understand the kind of special effects, space fantasy stuff that Lucas was doing. So it's interesting when you look back, Lucas was taking this treatment around. He took it to Universal, he took it to United Artists, he even took it to Disney, which, given the fact that Disney paid so much for the franchise a few years back, is a nice kind of turn up for the books, I guess. And ultimately what happened with Star Wars was that 20th Century Fox took it up, but they took it up because they wanted Lucas, not because they wanted Star Wars. American Graffiti had been such a hit, a surprise hit in some ways, but such a hit, that what they really wanted was Lucas's next proper film. And the way to get Lucas and attach him to the studio was to say, all right, you can have Star Wars, and kind of sign him in that way. And then Lucas took that on. I think the original budget was something like $8 million, which was tiny, really.
And with the original budget, so when Lucas signed in with 20th Century Fox, in Fox, with the executive at Fox, were they thinking about just one Star Wars movie, or
was it like a long-term trilogy thing?
I think Lucas was pitching this as a trilogy. He was pitching this as a sequence of stories. I think Lucas always imagined that this would be a long saga. The studio would just think, and would just get it out of the way, give him what he wants, and then we'll have him for the next real film. That's almost how Lucas pulls the kind of the rug from 20th Century Fox in terms of the merchandising. So when they're cutting the deal with Fox, American Graffiti has been such a hit that he could have claimed more money. His fee could have gone up from something like $150,000 to $500,000. And he said, I don't want that. But what I do want is the merchandising rights for Star Wars, and I want the rights for any sequels. And the executives of Fox thought, fantastic, because that's not real money. We're not paying him anything. We don't think this film has got any legs anyway. Of course you can have it. So they sign away all these things to Lucasfilm. And at the time, the idea of studios merchandising and tying things in just wasn't done. It was a very different environment.
So exactly. So by signing the special contract, really, it kind of revolutionized Hollywood in the sense that merchandising suddenly became a big thing. And going forward, was that, Lucas signing that contract, did other directors or how did it influence Hollywood going forward?
Star Wars really popularized, I suppose, movie tie-ins and merchandise. Before that, it really wasn't the done thing in movies at all. So again, he pulled off a significant coup there, I suppose, in being able to convince ultimately a small toy company, Kenner Toys, from Cincinnati in Ohio, to produce the Star Wars figures, creatures and beasts and vehicles and play sets ultimately as well. And they took a huge gamble. And they were really unprepared, I guess, for what was to come in terms of the demand from fans, because they had nothing ready for the Christmas of 1977. It usually takes...
So that's when the first film was released?
Yeah, in the UK,
In the UK, yeah.
It usually takes between 12 and 18 months for the concept of a toy to go from its original design through to production. So they were forced to come up with all kinds of strategies, really, to kind of sell a promise to children. And one of those was the early bird certificate package, where kids would send in a coupon, and when the first 4 figures were produced, Princess Leia, Luke Skywalker, R2-D2 and Chewbacca, they would be mailed alongside stickers and a cardboard display stand, the original figures, when they came out. And eventually over the toy run, from 77 through to the mid-1980s, around 100 figures were produced. A big gamble for Kenner, but it paid off. Massively. Because by the end of 1978, they'd realised a $42 million profit.
That is massive. And so, obviously, Lucas was able to negotiate that deal, but is that still something that directors can do now, or are the studios like taking all the merchandising for themselves, basically?
I think the studios are onto it now.
Yeah.
I think he wrong-footed 20th Century Fox. At the time that the deal was cut, Lucasfilm, bearing in mind it wasn't really anything at that point, had a bigger merchandising office than 20th Century Fox, which was a studio of such long standing. Prior to this, 20th Century Fox were paying fast food chains to advertise their movies. You think now McDonald's paid millions to have the rights to advertise these things. So that idea of revolutionising is something that George Lucas, in all sorts of ways, I think George Lucas is a revolutionary filmmaker. But that economic aspect, and George Lucas is as important as a producer as he is as a director or a writer or any other things. I mean, certainly in his mid-career, I guess, the production stuff was actually what we remember from George Lucas.
Cool.
They're very good at creating hype as well around the release of new action figures as well. So another kind of strategy.
Am I correct to say that the toys are now released before the movies are actually released to act as a promotion thing?
Exactly.
Right.
It is. It's part of the way in which you get the hype about the movies. The figures come out. We probably see it. So we've got Last Jedi coming in December this year. We'll start to see, I think, over the summer when the kids are off school and parents are thinking about ways of keeping them entertained, we'll start to see the first figures, the first vehicles. But in itself, that'll also start all the kind of the fanboy networks and all the Star Wars networks going off about, have you seen this design and it looks a bit like this, and start drawing those connections and creating that buzz and that hype about the look and the feel of the new movie, and people trying to work out plot points from the characters. So it's all part of that process of dragging us to the cinema in December to see the movie.
With the toys. We actually have a good question from Amy Gibson on Facebook, who says, help, my children are not Star Wars fans, how can I help them see the light? And I suppose toys are one way to do it.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, you can trace that trajectory all the way back to 77. This was an era, of course, before home video, before DVDs, before the internet, of course, before it's much easier now to watch Star Wars clips really at our own convenience. But then, really, kids only had the cinema, so they may well have seen it once, twice, if they were really lucky, a few times. But the toys allowed them to create those adventures over and over and over again in their bedrooms, in their back gardens and so on, which again made the toys very, very popular.
So essentially the toys kind of allowed the kids, or the fans, to stay in that Star Wars world. Is that correct?
I think so.
Yeah.
It allows you to own a bit of the universe.
Yeah.
And some fans take that to the extreme where their entire house is Star Wars. Everything from going to bed to going in the bath to eating food to, you know, the whole, you can live Star Wars in every way.
Day,
I mean, there's not a facet of everyday life which hasn't been, doesn't feature some piece of Star Wars merchandise, from ice cube makers all the way through to toasters. I mean, there's all sorts of Star Wars.
Fascinating.
Star Wars merchandise.
So we actually have like a really good collection of toys here. Dave, perhaps you could walk us through the different toys.
Yeah, sure. So we have some of these are all from the original line. Princess Leia, Luke Skywalker there. The Stormtrooper. Again, another kind of interesting strategy of Kenner Toys was to have figures that they considered troop builders.
Okay.
So you could build an army of
buy a lot of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas you might only need one Luke Skywalker. You know, you could have 10 Stormtroopers or more. So again, it encouraged perhaps mums and dads to buy more figures. Darth Vader, very popular figure. Boba Fett's interesting, the bounty hunter. He was one of the first mail-away figures. He actually appeared in figure form before he appeared in the movies, before Empire Strikes Back came out in 81. Again, another useful strategy of the toy company, encouraging fans to buy the figure.
And get involved with the whole myth and everything.
To get involved in the movie, yeah. Then we have the Jawa creature next to Boba Fett there. These were the scavengers, from Tatooine, Luke Skywalker's home planet. Originally, what's interesting about that figure is originally it came with a vinyl cape, so similar to the material that's used on Darth Vader there. And that figure was soon taken out of production because Kenner thought, given the size of the figure, kids perhaps weren't getting value for money, and replaced it with that richer looking cloth cape that the figure has now. But in mint condition and in box, admittedly, a Jawa figure in the vinyl cape went at auction recently for £18,000.
£18,000. I was actually going to ask, like, how much does those toys cost, because they are vintage?
They are vintage. Again, it all depends on condition, of course, and whether or not they have their original weapons or other accessories. You can pick them up loose like that for a few pounds. Okay. Where they are worth money is if they're in their original packaging. And some fans even collect the packaging, never mind the figures. So
just the packaging without the toys?
Yeah. Just a box. A mint box can go for ridiculous amounts of money without anything in it. Yeah.
Interesting.
That's the collector.
So we have another question on Facebook from Celine Smith, who says, Mark Hamill only agreed to sign on for Star Wars on the condition that he was given one of each piece of memorabilia from the set. Why do you think this was so important to him?
Well, Mark Hamill, aka Luke Skywalker, long before he was cast in Star Wars, actually, is a huge collector of aspects of American popular culture. Comics, toys, cars, etc. So the story goes that he'd asked George Lucas semi-seriously if he could have a piece of everything, merchandise-wise, that the crew used on set, and all the action figures and toys that came with it as well. Lucas agreed, and that's where his kind of collection comes from.
He was collecting toys of himself?
Yeah. I'm sure he has everything as well. But he wanted the T-shirts that the crew had used. He wanted, the clipboards and so on as well for his own personal collection. I think he has his own online TV show now where he interviews various other collectors from across America, sharing his experiences with them.
Another question from Lee's Ride. What impact has the merchandising of Star Wars had on cultural consciousness? Has this created a two-tier system for fans, purists and those who engage solely with merchandise? Is it really a two-tier?
I suppose it is, at least to some extent. I guess it depends on which Star Wars you grew up with. Obviously the original trilogies are the one I remember, so I tend to focus my kind of collection on the original figures. Not in box, I should say, but loose. You know, and that is the objective, I guess, with that collection, to try and complete it. 100 figures were made originally, so it seems like an achievable kind of hobby, I guess, in that regard. But Star Wars merchandise today is huge, really is a phenomenon in its own right, and stretches way beyond toys and play sets and so on. One could think of the hookup with Lego as being a particularly good example.
Which is just started, right?
Yeah. So I guess it depends on which Star Wars you kind of really remember growing up. I think it would be kind of financially a challenge to collect everything across the whole Star Wars franchise.
Unless you're Mark Hamill.
Unless you're Mark Hamill. I guess you know, it'd be very, very expensive to do that.
So we can say that Star Wars is more than a Hollywood sci-fi movie because of the cultural impact it has. But it's also interesting that when you place the trilogies in their different historical moments, like George Lucas is actually like saying different things. And, you know, for example, in the 70s, the post-Cold War, sorry, not post-Cold War, but actually the whole American boredom, exactly, post-Vietnam and stuff. So what was George Lucas trying to do? Why was he trying to, piggyback on what was happening in real life?
Well, I think even though George Lucas is the father of this incredible franchise, in a film which I think for some people is a child's film, that Star Wars seems to have that kind of childlike, mythological, good guys, bad guys simplicity to it. And I think it does that, but I think it's more complex too. But Lucas himself was a serious filmmaker. I mean, he was somebody who went to film school. His first film, if you look at THX 1138, which was a dystopian science fiction movie where people are drugged to suppress emotion, and it's all about Robert Duvall's character not taking his pills and experiencing a sunset. And there's a kind of an aesthetic and an artistic awareness about George Lucas. He's a serious filmmaker. George Lucas was going to make Apocalypse Now, which would have been, his version would have been an ultra-violent version of the Apocalypse Now we get from Francis Ford Coppola. So that sensibility lies behind something this popular. So the fact that he's engaged with what's going on in the times in which he's making the movies, I think all filmmakers are, whether they know it or not. I think George Lucas is a bit more explicit than that. So he was very consciously writing the original trilogy as a response to his historical moment, which was a time when America was in a bad place. All the kind of say the myths that underpin a society. So the myths are these things that societies kind of agree between them, stories that we can agree on, that give us consensus. So in American terms, that's the frontier, it's that kind of pioneer spirit, manifest destiny and American exceptionalism. The Vietnam War had shown a side of America that America didn't like very much, so it was feeling pretty vulnerable. And Lucas observes that, and his decision not to make Apocalypse Now was based on, and this is a direct quote from him, that he didn't want to make any more Isn't It Terrible What's Happening to Mankind movies, and make something that was truly mythological and uplifting and optimistic, and to show America that this is our best side, this is our own best instincts, and we should return to them. It's interesting as the trilogy develops. I mean, Empire Strikes Back is a very dark moment in the universe. I mean, it's a film where by the end of it, again, I saw that in the cinema when I was a kid, and I was convinced that Han Solo was dead at the end, and I was devastated. Coming out of the cinema, I just couldn't understand. What have they done? They've killed Han Solo. And obviously being a kid, I didn't that sense that the next film will be 3 years away. Well, it may as well be 30 years away before I'd find out what happened to him. And I think at that point, that's Lucas kind of expanding his understanding or his exploration of America, getting over the scars of Vietnam and the Vietnam era. And ultimately, that's why when the rebels blow up the second Death Star, for some people, that's lazy writing. Well, he did it in the first film, he did it in the third film. But actually, if you think about Lucas's purpose, it's an expression of I don't know, optimism that we can win. You know, we won before and we can win again, which is a great message for a country that's trying to get over something. And I think the prequel trilogies have a similar connection. I mean, when he was advertising and marketing these films around the film festival circuit, in the kind of the, certainly Revenge of the Sith, which came out in 2005, 2005 that one came out. He was talking about these are films about empire at a time when America was reviewing its role in the world in terms of the war on terror and the events around the time. So Lucas has had that engagement.
So there is actually like a difference between Phantom Menace, which was before 9/11, and post 9/11. So the prequel trilogy, there's a shift between the first film and the other.
And I think that makes a good indication of exactly what I'm talking about with Lucas as an engaged filmmaker. So The Phantom Menace is released in 1999, significantly pre-9/11. And if you look at the way in which the film begins with a trade dispute, which is like the lamest start for an exciting action-adventure sci-fi movie. People kind of grumbling over tax and all these kind of things. And the Jedi have been sent to negotiate a trade agreement. I mean, and it resonates, I think, with some of the ideas abroad in, not just America at that point, but the world at that point, that it was the post-Cold War, that the Soviet Union had collapsed, America had in some sense won, and there was nothing really left to fight about. There's nothing left to worry about. And it captures that kind of post-Cold War. So there are peacekeeping forces. The UN is trying to keep things stable by sending.
So there is in Phantom Menace, there is the allusion, the similarity between the Jedis and the UN, essentially, where they are a neutral force. They're trying
that are deployed into combat zones or conflict zones to try and resolve issues. And then, you know, so that's Phantom Menace. Attack of the Clones, which comes out in 2002. So significantly after the events of 9/11, the Jedi have been completely reconfigured. They're now a fighting force. And they're taking the fight to these people who want to do harm to the Republic. So it taps in immediately to some of these ideas of conflict and threat and paranoia that were abroad in America in 2002. And Lucas is quite explicit about this in his interviews, that he's referring to these things. He's talking about these things in the movies that he's producing.
And even in Revenge of the Sith, you know, some lines from Anakin are essentially George Bush's line, like the famous "You're either with me or you are against me" that Anakin says to Padme, essentially, which is George Bush.
Which was George Bush's line on the War on Terror, was as he was trying to, you know, he had this idea, very, very binary view on these things, so the axis of evil, and this idea that, yes, I mean, you know, George Bush actually said in the speech, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And that's something that Anakin uses to explain or to try and kind of resolve the issues with Padme. So again, those echoes and those references to the times make Star Wars more perhaps than it's often seen as this sci-fi franchise advert for toys type of thing.
Sometimes it's instructive, I guess, to think of Star Wars as a standalone movie as well. There's no guarantee in 77 that Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi would be made at all, although you had put together elements of that story and a huge backstory as well, I understand, before Star Wars came out, which became the prequels. So it's quite useful to think of it not as a trilogy at the same time.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned this because when you watch the first film, so New Hope, it does look like it's a standalone movie. It's
got a beginning, middle, and end. It has the medal ceremony at the end when, you know, the heroes are rewarded, and you have that scene of them all standing, except for Chewbacca. I always feel bad for Chewbacca. He does all the things he does in the film, and he doesn't get a medal. But you know, you have that kind of closure, that story is complete. If it had been a complete flop, and Fox hadn't had to make any more, Star Wars would be an individual film. But then it builds, and it's something you don't see in the subsequent trilogies, where you know everything is building up to another film, and so you have the cliffhangers and the plot points which are going to drag you through.
And the first trilogy, it has similarities to Western films, with Han Solo being the cowboy, for example. And actually we have a question on Facebook again from Jewel Clancy, who says, "I've read Star Wars in the form of space Western. If that is the case, why do you think the bad guys, the stormtroopers, were designed to be white in Westerns and the bad guys wore black hats?"
So I think the answer to that is that, yes, I think one of the ways, I don't think, Lucas is drawing on all sorts of different mythologies and all sorts of different sources for the story he's telling. The Western is one of them. So if you look at Luke Skywalker at the beginning, he's that kind of the rough pioneer American Adam type. So he, you know, tapping into that myth. Harrison Ford's character Han Solo is a kind of a John Wayne cowboy bit roguish, bit violent, good with a pistol type. So you have, and that's one of the mythological lines, if you like, of the film. But one of the other mythological lines I think the film is playing with is more along a kind of a military line, and it's the Second World War. That there are echoes all the way through, certainly the first movie, to issues relating to the Second World War and the American sense of the Second World War. And I think that's where you get closer to why the stormtroopers are the bad guys. It gives you that kind of memory of the stormtroopers from the Nazi era, the fact that Darth Vader is a Dark Lord, and it gives it that kind of European context, because part of the mythology that I think Lucas is tapping into is American memory of war. It's reminding, in a similar way, reminding America of something, that there have been times in our past when we've been up against it. So when we were fighting the Germans, or even, I mean, there's a way of reading the opening sequence of Star Wars as a reference to the American Revolution, which was another time which was a clear-cut thing for Americans. And being reminded of these things at a time when you're feeling kind of down and up against it is quite handy. But if you look at that opening sequence, so you have the big Star Destroyer chasing down the tiny blockade runner, and the bit when the stormtroopers come aboard, the fighting force that's ready to face the stormtroopers, they're all old men. Not old men, but older men. They're certainly not a kind of a youthful, strong, well-trained. They're a militia. And the fact that then you have this European image of evil, stormtroopers with the kind of Nazi thing, the Dark Lord, it figures into, I think, a kind of a reading. There's a historian called John Hellman argues this American Revolution reading, I think, really quite well in one of his books.
And with the new films, so obviously there's only one film in the new trilogy, but then there are the other films, so Rogue One, for example. So how, obviously George Lucas is not involved with the new films entirely. So do you think that the new films are still, trying to portray the current state of affairs, or do you think there's just movies now, like normal Hollywood movies?
I think in terms of I haven't made my mind about the new trilogy yet. I think Force Awakens in the first place is just establishing where the franchise is now. So it's echoes to the past, it's creating new characters for the future, and it'll be interesting to see in the second element. The second part of a trilogy is always dark, because there's a third bit, so it's got to end on a cliffhanger such that everybody's in peril, it's all up in the air, we don't know what's going to happen, and that's what's going to drag you back. And that's a lesson Lucas learned from watching Flash Gordon movies in the 1930s, the cliffhanger approach. So that it'll be interesting to see as the Last Jedi starts to come through whether there are more allusions to the way the world is now. I mean, the conflict seems closer now than it did a year ago in some ways with North Korea and everything else, and whether these will start echoing in the movies. I think the film that probably has a bit more purpose to it is Rogue One, because that is notionally a standalone film. It's related to the trilogy, but it's not part of the trilogy in any direct way. From one perspective, it's a classic old Second World War movie. It's the Dirty Dozen. It's about the coming together of this disparate band of individuals who have a mission, an objective. They undertake the mission. They're successful, but there's huge sacrifice as a consequence. And there's any number of Second World War movies have that as a pattern. I mean, so it figures into that idea of what we've got to do for our own security, what we've got to do to stand up and be counted. So that idea of kind of resistance and things like that are part of Rogue One, which I think makes Rogue One probably a film with more obviously to say about the times that we're in than perhaps the trilogy.
And obviously, do you think Disney is having a proper say in what the new movies will be like?
Well, I think so, yeah. And it'd be interesting to see, I guess, how the Star Wars universe expands over the next few years with the remainder of the original 9 movies to be produced and put together and released, and with these standalone movies as well, in terms of what stories they run with. We know Han Solo, for example, is to be
coming up,
featured in one of the standalone or spin-off movies. So it'll be interesting, I guess, to see what they do with his character, how he's kind of packaged for us.
So obviously, with Star Wars being so iconic culturally, there are a lot of key moments, or even different scenes or different aspects of Star Wars that's just part of popular culture now. So I wanted to go through some of them, but first, I guess we should talk about the Force first, right? Because it does look like it's this metaphysical force, and it has a collective power. So one can very easily say that it's very close to religion or spirituality. Why did Lucas include this concept in Star Wars? It's a major thing.
I mean, the Force can be read in all sorts of different ways, and I think even Lucas isn't sure what he means by the Force. So in the original trilogy, the Force is, I think Alec Guinness said at one point, it's all around us, it surrounds us, it binds us together. So there's almost a kind of a collective, oceanic thing going on, that it's just this thing that this diverse universe brings everybody's alignments together. You could argue that the Force, so in that sense, maybe it has some kind of religious thing. Is it nature? Is it simply, kind of the way things are? Is it kind of inside us? It's almost like a way of being, a way of thinking. And I think, I mean, the Force is suitably broad, that it's not going to alienate people by suggesting some uber religious. But for those who want to buy into that, it's there. Is it simply fate? I mean, the way Alec Guinness talks about it, there's many times when Han Solo says things like, oh, I ain't doing that. And Alec Guinness kind of raises his eyebrow and smiles, thinking, you're definitely going to do that, because it's kind of written into the Force. What's interesting is, I think that even Lucas gets a bit leery of the Force by the time he gets the prequel trilogy, because then when he finds Anakin as a young boy and decides that this kid is full of the Force, he starts talking about midichlorians. And this idea, it's almost kind of genetic, that there's a kind of a biologic, you can measure the midichlorians, and by measuring midichlorians, you know how full of the Force you are. So it kind of takes it away from any of that kind of metaphysical, theological, spiritual, personal type stuff, and creates a kind of a biological, scientific context for it, which fans weren't very happy about, because it was trying to explain something that, again, it's a bit like the Han Solo movie, trying to explain something that doesn't need to be explained. You know, it's fine as it is. Use the Force, Luke. It was a catchphrase in my generation anyway, no matter what you were doing. Messing about with that is kind of unnecessary.
And of course in the original movie, Han Solo dismisses the Force as simple tricks and nonsense as well. Has a pop at the lightsaber as being that more kind of civilized weapon of a more civilized age.
So ancient weapons and hokey religions are no match for a good blaster by your side, is the kind of the idea that he plays with.
Yeah.
And obviously the Force, the light side and the dark Force, obviously. So, the Empire is iconic, let's say. And what exactly is its ideology? Like, what does it stand for? Is it just like, bad people? Or is there more to it? What does it stand for in Star Wars?
Well, I think for Lucas, I mean, if we go back to that idea that somehow the original trilogy is trying to reconfigure that mythic landscape, the depiction of the Empire, really in quite straightforward terms, they're fascist, there's echoes, as we talk about, of the Nazis and those kind of things. They are simply evil. They don't need an excuse, they're simply evil. That's an interesting perspective, because at the time, in 1977, America was the empire. And the Vietnam War was an example of America being an empire. So one of the things the film is doing is kind of inverting for audiences, reminding, and that's why the revolutionary reading of the film is quite interesting, reminding audiences of a time when they were the rebels, when they were the guerrilla forces, when they were the underdog against the kind of the forces of empire. So it's trying to heal that mythic landscape by offering this version of a quite simplistic, black and white in different ways, representation of evil. And again, what the films do as it moves on, that becomes problematized and complicated in certain ways. So really, what certainly the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy is about Anakin. It's about how Darth Vader becomes Darth Vader, but then how Darth Vader is redeemed and moves back to the kind of the good side. And again, playing with those ideas that no matter how bad things are, there's always a possibility to put them right and make them better. But I think certainly in the terms of 77, the Empire is alluding to all sorts of things that are fairly obviously fascist, stroke Nazi. Even down to the fact that Lucas, again, is one of his reference points, was the film made by Leni Riefenstahl, the very famous Nazi propaganda movie Triumph of the Will. If you look at the medal sequence at the end, for example, when you've got the ranks of stormtroopers, and you put that alongside this film, which was made in 1934, of the rallies at Nuremberg, at the point at which Hitler was rising to power. It's not quite shot for shot, but that idea of the kind of the massed ranks of the empire, the kind of, and the visualization of technology and the kind of the shininess of the empire. It all harks back to some of these ideas. So it plays into that kind of mythic mission, that rehabilitation of the myth that Lucas is engaged with.
It's interesting, I guess, thinking about technology as well, with the Death Star being the ultimate emblem of the Empire's reliance on technology. And again, back to the Force, Vader tells some of the Empire's hierarching officers, don't be too proud of this technological terror that you kind of constructed. It's, as he says, the ability to destroy a planet is insignificant next to the power of the Force as well. So how it plays with a lot of those themes and tensions is quite interesting.
Yeah. And it does fit in with this mythic sense that in America, the underdog, the Rebels technology tends to be a bit flaky. You know, so Han Solo's always banging the Millennium Falcon to get it going again, and you know, it's like a used universe. All the technology is a little bit aged, and that, you know, within science fiction, that's quite unusual. Science fiction, if you think about the film which was probably most successfully released around the time of Star Wars, was 2001: A Space Odyssey, where everything was shiny, everything was kind of scientifically focused. This is quite a grubby universe. You know, the technology's not great. It all looks familiar because a lot of it was modelled on Second World War weaponry, which were then kind of modded to make them look futuristic. But the thing there is, and maybe this is something just to think about, that all these Star Wars films start with that same title card, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And what's interesting there, to me anyway, is the long time ago bit. Because if this is science fiction and there's hyperdrives and blasters and droids and everything else, why is Lucas suggesting it's a long time ago? Putting this in some kind of historical context. And I think it's because he's reflecting back on things like the Second World War, the Revolutionary War, the Vietnam War. He's kind of creating this historical frame for understanding, and then his kind of purpose then in rehabilitating the myth follows on from there.
Interesting. So another thing that we've seen in the three trilogies is there is some sort of fascination with fatherhood. So there is death of the father figure in the first film of all trilogies. So that seems to be a conscious choice. Is this pure Lucas? Is there a deeper meaning to it?
I think in the first place, I mean, we've been talking about myth, and one of the key texts relating to myth was a book by Joseph Campbell called Hero with a Thousand Faces. And Lucas was very, very impressed by that book, and he was very taken with the book. He met Joseph Campbell as he was putting together Star Wars. And what Campbell suggested is that all myths have 12 steps. And it's things like the hero crosses the threshold, so the point at which the hero leaves the family home and goes on his adventure. One of them is always, or is some version of, the grandfather figure passing on the torch of adventure. So the idea that all these films have a father figure in them, this kind of older figure who sets people on their quest, or even if they're not setting them on the quest, is part of the quest. So Han Solo, and spoiling for people who haven't seen it, but Han Solo dying in Force Awakens, in a sense, sets Kylo Ren, but also Rey, in different directions. It establishes certain kind of drives for the narrative. So I think in that sense, it's a nod to, in the first instance, a nod to that myth, to those structures of myth. But I think it became a pattern then that he used. So Qui-Gon in the first trilogy, and that sets Obi-Wan on his path. It's Obi-Wan in the first film, and then Han Solo in the third. But Lucas does that throughout. I mean, and that's one of the things about myth, is that's why we can agree on them, because we recognise these patterns. They make sense to us.
Does that mean that the next film will, The Last Jedi, will see the demise of Luke Skywalker, because he's obviously going to be training a new Jedi?
Yeah.
And then for that new Jedi to, complete it.
If you think how Luke was trained, Yoda survived the second film. Yoda dies at the start of the Return of the Jedi, doesn't he? Yeah. So I don't think they'll follow that pattern. I hope they don't kill Luke off in the second film. I think they're going to have to do something a bit more dramatic. But you're right. I mean, the idea that once he's passed on his wisdom, what's the point of Luke Skywalker in some ways? Once he's passing on that knowledge, passing on that sense of adventure to the next generation. That is what happens with Yoda. Yoda, once the knowledge is there, he does kind of ebb away because his work here is done, and then he becomes a Force ghost and becomes blue and turns up at the end of the movies.
So speaking of Yoda, so Yoda is obviously big Star Wars icon. Why is this attraction to Yoda? Is it just because of his way of talking, or is there more to it?
I think so. You're a very kind of famous Star Wars character, of course, a very popular figure as well, action figure in the original toy line. I guess much of it stems from his kind of centrality to the story as well. He's there to essentially explain the Force in Empire Strikes Back, and is a very prominent character in the original, the prequels as well.
That's the thing, right? So in the prequels, he's like central, but in the original trilogy, he has obviously a big role to play, but he he's like in only like one movie and then small part in the third movie.
But you could say that about Obi-Wan Kenobi. You think how central he is to the prequel trilogy. It's as much his story as it is Anakin's or anybody else's. Alec Guinness is in the first movie, and just long enough to say, there's your dad's lightsaber, let's get out of here. And then, you know, he kind of sacrifices himself to the greater mission when he faces Darth Vader alone, and Darth Vader strikes him down, and I'll become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. And he does. And it's that, you know, that prophecy stuff and becoming that ally to Luke, which goes through. And Yoda kind of does the same kind of thing. What's interesting, I think that was part of the buzz about the prequel trilogy, was all those promises about you're going to see Yoda fight. Because when, you know, Yoda in Empire Strikes Back is a little puppet with Frank Oz with the hand up and making him move around and all these kind of things. And as he got more sophisticated, the fight scene, yeah, absolutely, the fight scene with Christopher Lee as Count Dooku in Attack of the Clones, this kinetic, frenetic combat, it was brilliant. It was actually probably one of the best things in Attack of the Clones in some ways, seeing Yoda in his prime. And again, that's another reason why we keep coming back to Star Wars, because we're getting all these different visions of characters that we know in one context, but then we get to see in another. And it's the thing that keeps us coming back, keeps developing the universe, giving us those views on different aspects of it.
And we obviously need to talk about the Stormtroopers, just because I have it in my t-shirt as well. So what's striking with the Stormtroopers is design has stayed pretty much identical, and they've been from the original movies, and the big hit, obviously. So was there, like, you know, a lot of thought put into it, or why is it so relevant today as it was 40 years ago?
Well, the design of the Stormtroopers is iconic, really, isn't it? And you have collectors, I guess, who concentrate solely on collecting, you know, the figures of the Empire, Stormtroopers included, of course, and back in the timeline, I guess, to the clone troopers as well. Kenner often was working with not too much information, actually, but they did for the Stormtroopers. The Greedo figure, for example, is, you know, facially very good, but his body less so, because they didn't have many photographs to work with. But the Stormtrooper is absolutely an iconic figure. I know Steve's favourite.
Well, and it is. I mean, I've stopped collecting toys a while ago now, but I still collect troopers, because they have got that. That's the thing that when I think back to my 5-year-old self watching this film, that was the thing that stuck with me. But the idea of design, I mean, you know, going back to what we said earlier about how the studio didn't care about Star Wars, they cared about Lucas. Lucas cared about Star Wars. So when he was designing the universe, he put huge amounts of effort in. He hired a guy called Ralph McQuarrie, who was this very kind of innovative and interesting graphic designer, to create visions of the world. And the Stormtrooper was one of the first things that he created. So the fact that the universe looks the way it does comes from a huge amount of thought and effort and real artistry. That the design was important here. It's not simply things thrown together, so we'll have an alien and it'll have tentacles and everything was thought through very, very, in a way that the $8 million budget, well, it ran over budget precisely because Lucas was doing this kind of stuff. But there was a lot of work went into the design. So the fact that it's kind of timeless, I think, is an indication of the seriousness with which the universe was put together. And it's something when you think back, I mean, 1977 was the first time we saw that character. He still looks as fresh and as, lots of things from the 1970s don't look so fresh anymore. They have that kind of, that old look to them. Even though they've been smartened up, as your t-shirt suggests, for the new trilogy. I mean, somebody called them kind of eye troopers, suggesting that Apple had a hand in the redesign. But they still, the echoes are there. And that's one of the ways, I mean, just from the point of view of collecting these things, you can see the kind of, it's another way of mapping the evolution of film, as the different armor sets move from the clones through to the troopers, through to the, you can see different influences and different designs coming through. So the trooper is another thing that which connects the trilogies up. And I have to say, when I was in the cinema last Christmas watching Rogue One, seeing the troopers from 1977 back on the big screen again was terrific.
So really, the troopers kind of tell us how much thought was put into creating the whole universe and the whole trilogy.
I think so. I mean, it's one of those things that when you think this was a film from 1977, if you can, it's really difficult to do, because George Lucas went back and redid scenes and added bits and everything else. If you look at the original 77 cut of the film, it still looks as fresh as ever. It looks like it was made yesterday. And actually, the only thing that's aged Star Wars are some of the scenes that Lucas put in '97, because they're computer generated, and you can tell where they are, and it doesn't look so well. But I mean, it's a perfect indication of the seriousness and the thought that went into what this universe looked like. Something that was missed on set. I mean, as they were making this, there was kind of mutinies, because they looked at what George Lucas was doing. They couldn't understand what these guys in white armour and this fella with a big, big stick, the glowy stick. What are we doing making this film? What's the story here? And it's because a lot of stuff would come in post-production in terms of special effects and matte work, and which was a completely new way of working for many actors. The 77 film is as fresh now as it was then, and it's because of that seriousness.
Because the sets are real, aren't they? They actually had to build everything from scratch, the ships, everything. So yeah, I still think it has its freshness to today, as it did back in the late 1970s.
So, obviously, Princess Leia, another central important character. And I actually have a very good question from Nadine Richardson on Facebook, who asked, was having a strong female role model in Leia unusual at the time, and did it influence strong women in today's movie culture? What do you think about this?
Yes. I mean, I think having strong women having women central to the story was probably still relatively unusual in 1977. I mean, you could argue actually Star Wars doesn't do that well. I mean, Princess Leia is essentially the only woman in the entire universe. When you've got Aunt Beru, maybe you've got Mon Mothma, maybe, and there's a couple of women in the background. But Princess Leia is interesting. She's feisty, she's young, at the same time as being feisty and quite dynamic. I mean, she stands up to Darth Vader, she stands up to Peter Cushing's character, Moff Tarkin, which takes character, which takes real strength. She's also a princess to be rescued, even if she undercuts that by saying, "And you were a little short to be a stormtrooper," when Luke Skywalker walks in. But
she's also a leader of the Resistance as well.
And I think that's the point, is that, again, from that film on, she becomes more important, more central, and she becomes, as you say, a leader of the Resistance. Right the way up to now, she leads the Resistance in The Force Awakens. She is the kind of the general in that role.
But it's interesting to also mention, I mean, we should probably also mention that in the third film of the first trilogy, like, there is this scene where she is quite objectified, and how did that go in?
Well, I suppose it's in context. I mean, she's been taken prisoner by Jabba the Hutt. Jabba the Hutt's meant to be this very kind of primitive, greasy, horrible, he's kind of mafia, he's a criminal. And what he's done is he's turned her into a slave. So she's on a leash. She's in this kind of curious bronze bikini setup. And it's a curious image because, yes, it is a total objectification, which still gets referenced now. I mean, I think Friends referenced it and Big Bang Theory referenced it. It's become iconic in its own way.
But surely with the new trilogy, for example, something like this would just not fly, right?
Yeah, I don't think that would happen. And partly I think that's because, partly it's Disney. I think Disney have really taken that need to be inclusive and to offer these women. So both Rogue One and Force Awakens, and well, the new trilogy, have as their central character women, whether it's Jyn Erso in Rogue One or Rey in Force Awakens. I think that's quite deliberate. In the same way as John Boyega being the character in terms of that kind of diversity is also a deliberate policy. You could argue that when Lucas was in charge of the prequel trilogies, Padme, so Natalie Portman's character, was objectified to some extent. I mean, there's a scene in Attack of the Clones where they're in the arena and all the big beasts are kind of having their go, and she gets slashed across the stomach and her top kind of comes off, so there's a bare midriff, and so there's something slightly akin to that sequence. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it's become iconic, the Princess Leia Jabba slave sequence.
And Jar Jar Binks, obviously very divisive character, shall we say, but what's its place in the trilogy? Well, in the new Star Wars universe, it seems that it might be divisive among fans, but the younger generation, especially the children, are quite attracted to Jar Jar Binks. So was this deliberate?
Well, I think in part he's there for the kids in many ways. It's perhaps no surprise that he plays a very, very, very small role in Attack of the Clones. Only really a cameo scene, really. But he is quite prominent, I guess, in the Phantom Menace. Very childlike character, I guess. Again, a popular figure. I suppose some of the criticism perhaps that's come Lucas's way is that the prequel trilogy is nothing but an extended kind of toy franchise. So many characters, so many kind of toys associated with that, of which he is one.
But I think, I mean, if you go back to that question we had earlier on about, how do I get my children to watch this? Jar Jar Binks is kind of the answer, because if you watch children watching Jar Jar Binks, they laugh and they giggle and they love him. I mean, we have all sorts of problems with him, both in terms of the writing and the character. There's also some dodgy racial stuff going on there, that he talks like a like a Jamaican. So there's an accent, accent that's put on for that. Phantom Menace was full of that kind of stuff. That the trade bad guys have some kind of faux Japanese accent, and critics at the time picked this up. That there's a bit of stereotyping going on if you want to read it that way. So he's a very problematic character that way. But he's key to the plot of Phantom Menace. I mean, he's the glue that brings everybody together. And ultimately, I think there was a reading of the films whereby Jar Jar is the one who creates Darth Vader almost, because he signs or creates the Empire. Because there's a scene, I think, in Revenge of the Sith where he's the casting vote in some decision, which allows Palpatine all the power. So actually Jar Jar Binks ruined it for everybody. And he's the ultimate enemy.
So we kind of reaching towards the end of that session, but we have to talk about the Star Wars Christmas special. That was aired, if I'm not mistaken, in 78, so 1 year after the first film. And it was a massive flop.
Yes.
How? Well, why?
I mean, I think in some ways this is probably the merchandising thing gone too far. So yeah, it was this Christmas special where you had At Home with the Wookiees. So you saw Chewbacca's house and you saw his wife and you saw his kids. One of the interesting bits which fans are still really interested in, it was one of the first times we saw Boba Fett in action, because there was an animated Boba Fett film in there. Terrible animation. I mean, it wasn't of any kind of quality whatsoever. But it was capturing. I mean, by 78, Fox realised what they had on their hands, so they were doing everything. They were just, Star Wars was everywhere. And I think in the whole history of Star Wars, that's probably the only time they've really put a foot wrong in terms of making a product which simply doesn't work. I mean, there's things in the world of computer games have done that. So there was an Xbox Kinect game, Star Wars Kinect, and there's a sequence in there, because Kinect is that thing where you move around in front of it instead of using a controller, that there was a dance game, so you could dance like Han Solo to the Cantina theme, and it's just outrageous and ridiculous. And but because the graphics were so good, it looks like Harrison Ford's dancing to the Cantina scene. So there've been some missteps with it. That was probably the most famous. But now even that's sought after by collectors, because it's not been released on DVD or video. It's only, I think, been captured on people who, at the time, I mean, imagine having a video player in 1978. It must have been...
So did they actually try to suppress it after it's been released because of those bad reviews?
I think so. I think Lucas kind of stepped on it and kind of was, that's it, and hide it in the vaults. But people have recorded it. So you can, if you want to, go on YouTube, type in Star Wars Christmas Special, and you can probably watch the whole thing, or at least sequence of it on YouTube.
It's there, it hasn't stood the test of time, I guess, unlike the original movie.
It didn't stand the test of time in 1978, so 40 years later, it's pretty ridiculous, but interesting as a cultural artifact.
Interesting question from Relso Oslo on Facebook. What possible correlations could be drawn between the fiction of Star Wars and global governance? I think this kind of puts us back to, will the new trilogy deal with Trump, for example, or with New America?
Yeah, I mean, there are all those echoes. I mean, we talked about it in terms of the prequel trilogy, and seeing how global issues and conflicts are being resolved by this peacekeeping force. And I mean, it'd be interesting to see how this concept of the Empire develops from here on in. How the First Order, this new way of configuring the world. Because Trump is interesting in that way, that he came in his election, and in the inauguration, America first, and it was all a very clear vision of what America's role in the world would be, which was none, because we're going to turn inwards and pull up the draw. And he's been, in the first 100 days, probably one of the most active presidents in getting involved in things. So it'll be interesting to see whether that revision of the American role in the world, and the contradictory rhetoric around it, that on the one hand it's about kind of protectionism and isolationism, but at the same time we're bombing Syria, and to see if that starts to map onto the way in which the empire looks, or the way in which the rebellion develops. So I think in terms of the new trilogy, it's kind of watch this space, really.
And what's next with Star Wars? It's obviously under Disney now, and it seems that they want to have a new Star Wars movie every year. So there's the new trilogy, there are the anthology films like Rogue One, Harrison Ford movie. So will they keep milking it in a way, do you think? Is that it's just going to be Star Wars, Star Wars, Star Wars?
I think so, and there's a danger, I guess, that it can become oversaturated, not least of all with the merchandise in mind. But I suppose it will be interesting to see what they do with the Star Wars universe after The Last Jedi and after Episode 9 comes out in a couple of years' time, because it's following the Marvel route, essentially now, where we will have essentially each year a new Star Wars movie. So it'd be quite revealing, I guess, what characters they tease out in terms of developing their own individual storyline.
In a way, if they keep pushing it with more Star Wars films, so you don't think that there will be like Star Wars fatigue, for example, where people are just, another Star Wars movie?
There's no sign of that,
There's no sign of
on
that.
the horizon,
Okay.
at least immediately.
Yeah. I mean, it could happen. It depends. I mean, I know that there's talk that the episode 9 will be the last of any kind of trilogy thing. So that will be the end of the Skywalker saga. Whether they'll start a whole new trilogy then, or whether they'll do different things, I don't know. But you're right, it is a thing. But it doesn't show. You think about the Marvel universe with all the superheroes. The Avengers is roughly the equivalent of the trilogy movies, and then you get the individual standalone Doctor Strange and Black Panther and all these kind of things. And they I don't know what they're up to, but are they up to the 20s? I mean, in terms of the number of movies you've got in that sequence.
And it's like it's TV shows.
It's everything,
Netflix has like 4 different TV shows, and they're doing more with all of them together as well. So
and just the crossovers, I mean, and Star Wars has that. If you look at some of the animation, for example, so Star Wars Rebels is now crossing over with the movie. Some of the characters in Rogue One are actually characters in that Rebels cartoon, and then they take on kind of a real role in the film. So I suppose it depends how innovative Disney continues to be with the way in which they continue the material. What is, I think, a very good sign is that Disney seems to be hiring interesting people to make these films. So Rian Johnson, Gareth Edwards, these aren't hack directors, if you like, people who are just kind of jobbing around. They all have a kind of a vision. They're directors who have a clear sense of what they want to make, and their record going into it. Rian Johnson's really interesting. I mean, Looper and those kind of things have a very quirky sensibility to them. And now he's in charge of this billion-dollar franchise. So it's very interesting as long as they keep doing things like that, because although I think the Disney executives will keep taking the sharp edges off things, as happened when they had to send Rogue One back for some edits and some reshoots and things like that, I think that it'd be very hard to stifle the voice of some of these directors. So as long as they keep making those kind of decisions, I think Star Wars will continue to be relevant and fresh, and we'll still buy tickets.
I think as long as there's demand for it, there'll always be Star Wars.
Which is a good thing.
Yes. Most
so just to finish off the last question, so we have the new generation joining the whole Star Wars saga now with the new trilogy and the new films. What do you think they will remember with Star Wars? So going forward with the new generation, what's Star Wars to them, do you think?
I think what I remember is the spectacle of it. So I think Steve mentioned earlier the famous opening scene of the blockade runner trying to escape the huge Star Destroyer that's trying to track down the plans of the Death Star. So there's that. The visual nature of the Star Wars universe is still very, very appealing, and all the creatures and so on that we're introduced to, it lives long in the memory. Yeah.
And I think for the new generation, it's the same as it was for any other generation. It's the characters. So these are characters that you carry with you. I mean, whether it's you're attracted to the bad guys. I mean, for me, it was the Stormtrooper. So Kylo Ren, I think, is something that's very popular with the kids, with the helmet and the curious lightsaber that has the red bit sticking out of the side. And I think it's that. These are the things that, because they're going to be associated with a certain time in their life, nostalgia and childhood, these are the things they're going to carry forward with them.
So Star Wars is just going to go as strong as ever.
I think so. There's a lot of Star Wars left, without a doubt.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I mean, obviously we could talk about Star Wars all day.
For a long time.
All day. Thank you so much on Facebook for sending in your comments, and may the Force be with you. Cheers.